Yes, you've really put your finger on it. I think the implications of this election for cross-strait relations are potentially quite substantial.
That story is coming up in just a moment. From Seoul, South Korea, you're listening to Asia News Weekly. The protests in Hong Kong's get violent. What does Taiwan's election mean? And the sex slave talks come to an end. These stories and more are on the December 5th edition of Asia News Weekly. Hello everyone, and welcome to this week's show. I'm your host, Steve Miller, and I'd like to thank you for listening and downloading this week's podcast. Activity virtually exploded in Hong Kong over the weekend, as authorities made a big push to clear out protesters from where they've been encamped for more than 2 months. During that push in Mong Kok, Lester Shum, one of the leaders of the Hong Kong Federation of Students, and Joshua Wong of Scholarism, were arrested. When Wong was released on bail, which was 500 Hong Kong dollars, which is also the same as 65 US dollars, he was greeted by anti-protest members who threw eggs at the student leader. Wong was one of 150 protesters taken into custody, and after he made that bail, it was announced he was barred from returning to the site until after January 14th. He also accused police of using excessive force. Quote, "The police had pressed me to the ground to limit my movement and injured me in the process. This caused injury marks to my neck and face, and they consecutively, 6 to 7 times, tried to hurt my body, including my private parts." End quote. Amnesty International said police action had seen unjustifiable force against protesters, bystanders, and journalists. The heavy-handed approach by police violates protesters' rights to freedom of expression and peaceful assembly, and risks exasperating an already tense situation, said Mabel Au, director of Amnesty International Hong Kong. Not backing down, protesters vowed once more to take their calls for democracy to the government complexes, something lawmaker Emily Lau didn't approve of, and said as much in an interview with The Voice of America.
I support the occupation movement from the start when it was proposed by the Occupy trio. Professor Benny Tai, Professor Chen Kin-man, and Reverend Chu Yao-ming. And their proposal was to occupy the street and so that cars cannot go past and then be arrested by the police. They never suggested that we should block any government building or commercial building, let alone rush in to occupy a government building or any other building. So that's what I agreed to from the start, and that's what I think should be the case. And I don't support blocking government office.
The students did try to enter the government buildings, but failed to cause any significant disruption. Quote, "The plan was a failure on the whole, given that even if some places were occupied, they were cleared by the police immediately," said Hong Kong Federation of Student leader Alex Chow. The city's chief executive, Leung Chun-ying, warned protesters from returning to the area around the government complexes, saying police had been tolerant but would now take resolute action, suggesting that patience may have finally run out. These events have set the stage for what probably has been the most intense series of events since the protest's beginning, with continued scuffles between the police, who have been using pepper spray and batons to control the crowds. Bruce Loy is a senior lecturer at Hong Kong Baptist University's School of Communication, and I asked him if leaders had a plan to move the protest forward.
I don't think up to now there is really some workable plan to move the things forward to realize their original demands, such as the step down of CY Leung and the turnover of the NPC's decision. Yeah, I don't think there will be something compromised by the Beijing government and the leaders of the Occupy campaign, and also from the student groups. Yeah, they really want to have something to be done beautifully before they withdraw from the street and then return to the community. hunger strike is something to keep the momentum of the campaign. But I think after the brutal clearance of the police, a lot of protesters on the street, they know that it is about time for them to go. The court order is approaching, and then the leaders are turning them to the police soon. And before the overall public opinion really turn against them, they want to still get the support and then to move the campaign to the community. So I think they are trying to do something beautifully before they end the streets protests. The one happened 2 days before surround the government headquarters is one of their efforts, although it is not a successful one. And then after this failure, it will make them a bit hesitate to step up for any other plans, and they are the groups, and then the protesters and the groups are having more and more disagreement. So the court order on MOT will be carried out, I think, maybe in 1 or 2 weeks' time. When it clears all the legal procedures, then it will be done no matter how. So on that occasion, I think it may be an inevitable time for the protesters to withdraw.
You'll be able to hear our complete conversation in the next Asia Now podcast, which will be released on December 10th. Occupy Central founders Benny Tai, Chan Kin Man, and Chu Yu Ming announced they would turn themselves in to the Central Police Station at 3 p.m. local time on Wednesday, a few days ahead of what was previously published. While they were released about an hour after their surrender, Benny Tai said that they were ready to face whatever consequences faced them. Quote, "The government that uses police batons to maintain its authority is a government that is beyond reason for the sake of the Occupy safety, for the sake of our original intention of love and peace. As we prepare to surrender, we three urge the students to retreat, to put down deep roots in the community, and transform the movement," said Tai. You can read the entire statement in a link provided in the show notes of this podcast. Tai said that the act of surrendering was not an act of cowardice or admission of failure, but it certainly can be painted as much from Beijing's perspective. Tai urged other protesters to retreat and prepare for the long haul. It's unclear whether the protesters will agree to back down. Several student leaders have said that they will not surrender, insisting instead on further escalation, something that has little support outside the protest circles. Joshua Wong, who I mentioned earlier has begun a hunger strike, hopes his actions will lead to further talks with the government. Quote, "We admit that it's difficult in the future to have an escalated action, so besides suffering from batons and tear gas, we would like to use our body to get public attention on the issue. We are not sure if the hunger strike can put pressure on the government, but we hope that when the public finds out about the student hunger strike, they will ask themselves what they can do next." To be sure, the end of the Occupy movement is at hand, not necessarily in spirit, but in the streets. As Bruce Loy mentioned, additional injunctions have been issued, and Hong Kong's chief executive has made it perfectly clear he will empty the streets using any means possible. Benny Tai and his colleagues may not be the faces of the Occupy movement, having been eclipsed by the student leaders, but they possess the wisdom to know that this round in the fight for universal suffrage is coming to an end. The calls to retreat, regroup, and develop a new strategy should be heeded. One last note, several British members of Parliament on the Foreign Affairs Committee were denied visas to enter Hong Kong. China viewed the visit as a foreign power meddling in its internal affairs. The United Kingdom wanted to investigate the situation, as there have been questions as to if the Chinese government was upholding its end of the joint declaration. That move should have been anticipated, and at this point shows that the United Kingdom is ready to talk about the issue in Europe, but do little else. As events continue to unfold, follow the Asia News Weekly Twitter and Facebook feeds for updates. Will Thailand ever return to democracy? That story in just a few minutes. Taiwan went to the polls this past weekend, setting up a key confrontation between the Kuomintang Party, or the KMT, and the Democratic Progressive Party, or the DPP. It was the island's biggest election, which included over 11,000 offices up for grabs, and was viewed largely as an indicator of where the winds were blowing, either towards the KMT in Beijing or shifting towards the DPP. Taiwan's Central Election Commission said that 18.5 million residents were eligible to vote and expected a near 70% turnout. With Taiwan's President Ma approval rating hovering at 20% or lower, the KMT expected some losses, but what it got was a beatdown. The KMT began the election holding 15 of 22 cities and counties in Taiwan. When the votes were tallied, the number dropped to 6. It's widely suspected that President Ma will be held accountable for the party's defeat and stepped down as KMT head on Wednesday. Jiang Yanhua, the prime minister, also accepted responsibility and resigned from his post. What does this DPP win mean for Taiwan's relationship with mainland China? For that, I'd like to welcome back Scott Harold, political scientist with the RAND Corporation.
Hi, Steve. How are you?
I am doing well. How are you doing?
I am good. Shall we have a chat about Taiwan?
Super. So my first question is, we knew the KMT was going to have a hard time with the elections over the weekend, but were there any indicators that the defeat that we saw would be so great?
I think if there were indicators, they were not in the polling, but were instead in the widespread sentiment since 2009, around the time of the Typhoon Morakot disaster and onwards, that the general public in Taiwan was dissatisfied with the Ma Ying-jeou administration's handling of governance issues as well as issues that are more purely political. And looking at Taiwan politics and social history over that time, you can see an awful lot of issues that can be folded into that discussion. Everything from the death of a soldier due to hazing to a scandal over tainted food oil, to the president's effort to try to dismiss the Speaker of the Legislative Yuan from the Nationalist Party and the feuding that went on between President Ma and Speaker Wang Jinping, to a series of visits by Chinese officials where there appeared to be growing influence from China on the island, to the sunflower movement of earlier this year and the Cross-Strait Services and Trade Agreement, and also some land condemnation or government taking of private lands. All of these combined to create an image of a president and, in many ways, a party in the Nationalist Party that I think the Taiwanese people appear to have looked at and said, that looks like what politics looked like in the past in Taiwan, but it's not what we want politics to look like in the present and the future. At least that's how I think a lot of the respected analysts looking at Taiwan today are interpreting this and are suggesting that the roots of this electoral wipeout for the Nationalist Party lie in a sense of a broader referendum on the way that the Nationalist Party, led by President Ma Ying-jeou, who's also has been up until and will be up until this week, this Wednesday, the chairman of that party, how they had been handling politics in Taiwan.
Now, we saw also that the now former Prime Minister Jiang stepped down, taking political responsibility for this. Now, when the control transfers later on this week, what do you foresee Ma's political future being?
I think it's pretty clear that that President Ma's time in office is pretty much all that remains to him. He is likely, at least from the vantage point that we sit at presently, I think he's unlikely to exert substantial influence over the Nationalist Party after he steps down. He's been suffering very, very low public approval numbers for a very long time now. The last number I remember seeing some months ago was down around the single digits, 9% approval. And in the factional breakdown of the KMT, President Ma is not commanding a very widespread following at present, I don't think. Many of the people who are potential successors to President Ma for leadership positions or even potential successors for national elected position are running away from him. He does not have a reputation of being collegial so much as being cutthroat and being willing to fight those who would cross swords with him very, very effectively, although not in ways that are necessarily building morale within the party. So I suspect that after he leaves office, there are not going to be a lot of there's not going to be a lot of legacy influence that he'll be able to exert beyond that time. Similarly, one might think to the way that when the former President Chen Shui-bian stepped down, he was almost immediately repudiated by everyone in the Democratic Progressive Party because of the allegations of ineptitude and corruption that were associated with him.
Looking forward, what does this mean, or what could it mean for cross-strait talks between Taipei and Beijing?
Yes, you've really put your finger on it. I think the implications of this election for cross-strait relations are potentially quite substantial, especially because they're occurring and unfolding against a backdrop of an increasingly assertive, self-confident, but also sometimes abrasive China that's looking to create or demand, in many ways, increased say and increased space in the Asia-Pacific. And moreover, and more immediately, what's happening in Hong Kong, where the inability of the central government in Beijing and its local representatives in Hong Kong to effectively and legitimately deal with the demands for greater inclusion, transparency, and accountability from Hong Kong society have effectively undercut a lot of the message that China had sought to convey across the Taiwan Strait, which was that a one country, two systems model as applied to Hong Kong could also serve very effectively to woo publics in Taiwan. And I think now that's quite clear that that's not the case. So where does Beijing go from here? How does it imagine that the next round of leaders who come to power in Taipei will find a modus vivendi on cross-strait relations? It's not very clear right now. I think for many years the prevailing wisdom was the Chinese government would find a way to live with the DPP if the DPP was reelected. But I think those assumptions were largely premised on the notion that the DPP might come to power in 2016 if it did, in a relatively contested and constrained environment where there would still be a major check on the DPP from the KMT, which, if you'll remember, when President Chen Shui-bian of the DPP was in office, the DPP never held the legislative yuan. And so there was a divided government, and that really put some serious constraints on what the DPP could do. If, on the other hand, what we're seeing is a substantial breakdown in the KMT's ability to compete effectively for legislative and executive power, that if that were to happen, that would severely call into question China's strategy of trying to check the ambitions of the Democratic Progressive Party by using or relying on the nationalist KMT. If the DPP were to come to power in a very big way in 2016, one can imagine that there may be some strong anxieties returning to China and to Beijing over this issue. Now, the DPP, I think, is much more sophisticated in 2014 than it was in the period 2000 to 2008, even in the period from 2008 to 2012. They have thought long and hard about what to do and how to manage cross-strait relations. I think it will still be very difficult for them. I don't know that they've come to a clean answer, but I think that they've got a lot more sophisticated ideas about how to handle that relationship today. And they will themselves be constrained a bit by the fact that President Ma has signed so many cross-strait deals.
Scott Harold is a political scientist with the RAND Corporation, and I'd like to thank him very much for joining me this week.
Absolutely, Steve, anytime.
But what do you feel is in store for Taiwan? What do you think will happen with the cross-strait talks between Beijing and Taipei? Please leave your thoughts in the comments on Facebook or Twitter. Seoul and Tokyo held their 5th round of talks on Japan's use of sex slaves. I said it would be a waste of time having the talks, and you'll hear why after this. In May of this year, the Thai military, under the leadership of Prayut Chan-o-cha, led a bloodless coup, ousting the government of Yingluck Shinawatra. The junta promised the reforms so many had called for, new elections in 2015 once those changes had been implemented. This week, the junta announced it would not be possible to hold the elections as originally planned due to opposition. Sunai Pasuk, senior researcher on Thailand for Human Rights Watch, told the VOA the change was expected.
It's not a surprise at all. It's clear that the junta has no commitment to fulfill the promise to restore democratic civilian rule within a year. Political activity, including activity of political parties, have been banned. There is no assurance that when election happen, it is going to be a free and fair election where everyone can contest freely, can express their campaign freely.
The earliest date for an election now is set for sometime between February and March of 2016. Speaking of Yingluck Shinawatra, the new legislature moved forward its plans to impeach the former prime minister. Yingluck and her family are not liked by the Thai military and royalists. Her impeachment hearing is set for January 9th of next year. Pavan Chachavalpongpun, a Thai expert and junta critic at Kyoto University, told the AFP, quote, "This is all part of the attempt by the junta to eliminate the Shinawatras from Thai politics. The junta is trying to install infrastructure through drafting a new constitution and also through a series of pending cases to make sure that if there is ever another election, someone like Yingluck or someone closely associated with her will not be able to stand." End quote. Despite all those political maneuverings, many in Thailand say that things generally remain calm, orderly, and better than before. What else is happening in the Asia-Pacific region? Coming up, the weekly brief with stories you might have missed. South Korea and Japan met last week for the 5th round of talks to discuss issues and possible avenues of resolution for the long outstanding issue of Japan's use of women as sexual slaves during World War II. Now, I've long said that such discussions are a waste of time, not because it isn't worth discussing the horrific human rights violations forced upon these women, but because Japan isn't interested in having a true dialogue on the subject. From the Japanese government's point of view, an apology was made in 1965 when normal relations returned between South Korea and Tokyo. Furthermore, compensation was also given at that time to all victims of Japan's colonial rule of the peninsula. In essence, the matter is settled. South Korea continues to argue that more compensation is warranted, sidestepping the fact that in some cases, more than 75% of Japan's remuneration was siphoned off by the South Korean government to be used in domestic infrastructure projects. Then there's the Asian Women's Fund, which was set up to provide additional compensation, but since it's funded by private donors and not the Japanese government, many refuse to take its money. The reason the two sides are meeting is because in that 1965 bilateral agreement, there's an arbitration clause inserted, stating that if additional compensation is sought, this is the avenue in which to seek it. However, there's no teeth in that clause, and Seoul is simply spinning its wheels, which is evidenced by recent developments. First, the Yomiuri Shimbun issued an apology last week for using the term sex slave and other inappropriate expressions in place of the commonly used comfort woman. In a statement, the newspaper cited 97 articles between 1992 and 2013 that used the terms in the English language version of the paper. Quote, "The Japan News apologizes for having used these misleading expressions and will add a note stating that they were inappropriate to all the articles in question in our database." End quote. The statement said the Japanese language edition of the paper had only used the term comfort woman, but that the expression comfort woman was difficult to understand for non-Japanese who did not have knowledge of the subject. Many conservative members of the Japanese government view the comfort women as nothing more than willing prostitutes and have been calling for a reversal of the landmark 1993 Kono Statement, in which a formal apology was made. Calls which have escalated in recent weeks after the liberal Asahi Shimbun retracted stories that had long been proved false about the forced abduction of Korean women. In the show notes, there's a link to our Asia Now podcast specifically about that story. The move by the Yomiuri Shimbun is seen as a further backpedaling and deepens the rift between these two countries, but not as much as the ask that was made during the talks themselves. Japanese officials demanded Seoul remove a statue erected by private groups in front of Japan's embassy and in other locations around the globe, commemorating comfort women, according to Yonhap News. Seoul reportedly responded that it cannot take down the monuments since they were installed by private groups. It's the same argument used by the government to not take any action prohibiting anti-Pyongyang groups from launching leaflets into North Korea. Yonhap quoted an unnamed high-ranking government official saying, quote, "If Japan resolves the military comfort woman issue, it will naturally influence the monument-building movement by private groups, and it is not something that the South Korean government could guarantee. Our position is that Japan should come up with resolutions that can appease the victims." End quote. Listener Kenny Dunlap expressed this feeling after reading the story on our Facebook wall. "I hope one day Vietnam puts up their own comfort women memorials to highlight what South Korean soldiers did there. Restitution has been paid and multiple apologies have been given. The continuous harping on this so-called issue is getting a bit old. All these, quote, monuments in countries that have absolutely nothing to do with this is a bit much. I get the feeling both governments just enjoy trolling each other." Dunlap makes a good point, because what does a comfort woman statue in Glendale, California really have to do with the actual issue? As much as the Korean government would like to take the high road in this matter, it can't. This summer, 122 women sued the Seoul government for what they called forced government prostitution following the Korean War. The plaintiffs in the suit claimed they were forced to provide sexual services to U.S. military personnel in government-designated special areas around U.S. military bases dating back to 1957. The women claimed their activities were controlled by the Korean government and have asked for about $10,000, a formal investigation, release of the findings, and an official apology. Quote, "Our government was one big pimp for the U.S. military," said Kim A-ran. She continues, "They urged us to sell as much as possible to the GIs, praising us as dollar-earning patriots." End quote. How do you feel about the comfort woman statues? Are they a sign of remembrance and a testament to the human rights violations of these women? Or are they a political tool used to sweep South Korea's own history under the rug and focus attention on Japan? Don't miss our Asia Now podcast. It's released every Wednesday and features stories and interviews from the Asia-Pacific region. This week on the podcast, what South Korea can learn from Germany's unification. Last weekend, Chinese President Xi Jinping gave a foreign policy speech. In it, he said, quote, "We should firmly uphold China's territorial sovereignty, maritime rights, and interests in national unity." End quote. It's statements like this that give many pause as to how territorial disputes in the East and South China Seas will be handled. In the past year, we've seen an uptick in rhetoric and confrontations, although Xi states he's opposed to, quote, willful use or threat of force, end quote. That being said, during the recent East Asia Summit, where a code of conduct for the region was once again brought up for discussion, China again refrained from making it a binding document and continued its land reclamation projects in disputed territories. One of which is the Fiery Cross Reef, which appears it might be able to support an airstrip and is counter to the code of conduct guidelines China has already agreed to. U.S. State Department spokesman Jeff Rathke.
Under Article 5 of the Declaration of Conduct among China and the members of ASEAN, the parties committed themselves to exercise self-restraint in the conduct of activities that would complicate or escalate disputes and affect peace and stability. large-scale construction or major steps to militarize or expand law enforcement operations at outposts, such as dramatically expanding the size of a feature through land reclamation, would seem to complicate or escalate the situation, in our view.
The East-West Center's Denny Roy said China's actions serve as a message to other claimant nations that eventually the entire area will belong to China, and that it's better now to come to their table to settle than later on down the road. He goes on to state that he and other analysts feel China is moving forward with their plan to exert control over the area, essentially becoming the rule setter for the region and force other nations to bow to its whims. And that, as I have said repeatedly over the past year, has been China's game. No one has stood up to China to halt its methodical expansion. ASEAN members have tried, but both Vietnam and the Philippines haven't been strong enough to stand up to China's maritime power. The United States and Japan both back ASEAN members, but they themselves haven't gotten directly involved. In terms of coming back to the table to work out a solution, the truth of the matter is China has no incentive to engage in such dialogue. Australian National University Defence Senior Fellow John Blaxland.
There's nothing in it for China to do otherwise. There is a strong domestic Chinese audience that is got an appetite for an assertive Chinese expansionist view about its role in the South China Sea. And there is no cohesive response to contain China's ambitions in doing so. And, of course, the issue is, that China's claims are, depending on who you ask, not that unreasonable. Depending on whose interpretation of history, whose interpretation of the laws, the international laws, whose interpretation of the legacy of the last 60, 70, let alone 200 years, whose legacy counts the most. That's the issue that is behind this point.
And that really sums things up nicely. There simply isn't an incentive for China to alter its plan. But do you have an opinion? If so, I'd love to hear it.
What else happened in Asia this week? I'm Michael Farrell with The Weekly Brief. Tensions between Seoul and Tokyo were not helped any this week, but not for the usual reasons. Japanese journalist Tatsuya Kato had his first trial hearing last Thursday for allegedly defaming Korean President Park Geun-hye in an article he wrote early August for the Sankei Shimbun. At the hearing, Kato denied defaming the president, saying he, quote, does not understand why the article on the relations between Park, who is single, and a man is regarded as a libel case, unquote. Moon Jae-in, who lost to Park in the last election, also came out against the case, saying the indictment was, quote, not in line with legal principles and precedents and global standards concerning freedom of the press, unquote. If found guilty, Kata could face up to 7 years in prison. Looking north of the DMZ, suspicions are falling on the Democratic People's Republic of Korea after a cyber attack against Sony Pictures. On Christmas Day, Seth Rogen and James Franco will hit the American big screen in the movie The Interview. It is Sony's new action comedy about an attempt to assassinate North Korean dictator Kim Jong-un. Hardly surprising, though, North Korea isn't too pleased about the picture. Last Monday, the computers at Sony Pictures failed, but not before displaying a red skull and the phrase, quote, hacked by #GOP, unquote. The grand old party hasn't gone crazy, though. According to the LA Times, the acronym stands for Guardians of Peace. Did North Korea orchestrate this attack? When asked if Pyongyang was involved, they replied, wait and see. 15 are dead and 14 are injured after a terrorist attack in China's Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region. In Sachet County, last Friday afternoon, a gang of attackers threw explosives into a market street and attacked civilians with knives. 11 of the attackers were killed by local police. Those who were injured are receiving treatment in local hospitals. There are some harsh music critics out there, but the most extreme appear to be in the Chinese government. On Monday, it was reported that China jailed a Tibetan singer for the political tone of his songs. Kalsong Yarfel, who mixes pop with traditional Tibetan music, was sentenced to 4 years in prison for participating in a concert that encouraged his people to unify and speak the Tibetan language. Some of his songs, like In Memory of Tibet and Tears, were even banned by the government. Yarfel's producer, a former Tibetan monk named Paim Rinzin, was also jailed. He will spend 2.5 years in jail for producing, quote, politically sensitive, unquote, DVDs. Yarfel and Rinzin are just the latest in a long line of Tibetan artists to be jailed for asserting their heritage after a number of protests rose across Tibet back in 2008. Vietnamese bloggers aren't faring much better than Tibetan singers. Vietnamese police arrested blogger Hong Ly To for posting, quote, online articles with bad content and false information that discredit and create distrust among people about state agencies, social agencies, and citizens, unquote, says the Ministry of Public Security. To's blog requires an invitation to be able to read his content, so we don't know exactly what he wrote about the government. Needless to say, they weren't very happy about it. Government crackdowns on public expressions of dissent have been on the rise in Vietnam, provoking the condemnation of rights groups and the West. However, with the rising popularity of blogging in the country, such displays of intolerance against free speech are only likely to get worse. The Gadimai Festival was in full swing in Nepal last weekend, though if you are a water buffalo or a goat, you really didn't want to be on the receiving end of that swing. An estimated 10,000 buffalo calves and 150,000 goats were sacrificed to Gadimai, the goddess of power, over that weekend. Once every 5 years, Hindus make the journey to the Gadimai temple 100 miles south of Kathmandu to gain the goddess's favor or thank her for her help. Unfortunately for the animals, this involves cutting off their head or slicing open their throat. Needless to say, animal rights groups are not exactly pleased by what the press is calling, quote, the world's biggest ritual slaughter, unquote. And this is not helped by the fact that many of the men performing the ceremony are not trained to end it quickly. Pramod Shah of Animal Welfare Network Nepal told CNN, quote, not all animals have their heads chopped off. Some take up to 40 minutes to die, unquote. If you want to click on the story link in the show notes, please be warned. The images of the festival are strikingly graphic. Finally, last week, Korea took home an unusual award. Ju Jung-chol, a native of Korea, won the 2014 Asia-Pacific Tintoff Championship in Malaysia. Competitors from all over the Asia-Pacific region, some from even as far as Australia and Kuwait, converged in Malaysia to see who could tint the windows of a Volkswagen Passat the fastest while still doing a good job. With a total of 94 points, Ju Jung-chol took home the $3,000 prize. He was followed in second by Lim Lok-chun of Malaysia and in third by Zheng Shihai of China.
Well, my friends, the podcast is winding down, but before I get to your comments, I'd like to thank Gimme a Break Man, Hiko Simon, and R. Wiseman for supporting the podcast through Patreon.com. I truly do appreciate it, and I'm happy that you find such value in the podcast that you'd like to put in some of your own money to help keep it going. All right, now before I go, let's take a quick look at some of your comments from this past week. Anthony Murphy had this to say about our story last week on North Korea threatening war. Actually, goading war is exactly what ensures their continuation. China enjoys the tacit power they wield in the region through them, and perpetually supplies the country in order to maintain this resource. It's a cheap and effective way to influence geopolitical goings-on. The King of Pop had this to say about Japan's snap election. Both Pyongyang and Seoul governments actually support Mr. Abe because he's doing favors to them. The more Japan heads to the right-wing sentiment and policy, the more better for Seoul. Abe's policy is making Seoul hugely favorable and giving free publicity for Seoul. The more Japan goes against Seoul, the more favor for Seoul. During the week, I shared a story about another Vietnamese blogger being detained and asked if people would ever consider blogging in countries where there were risks of being prosecuted. Maurice Fawcett replied, "I wouldn't get political in countries ruled by dictatorships. It's not worth it, in my opinion." Avigator wrote this in response to our Asia Now podcast on Japan's snap election. "Be careful what you ask, because you may get it, and voters can vote you out." Thank you so much for the comments this week. I truly do value them, and I truly do appreciate the time it takes to leave those on the sites where you do. Now, if you have a moment this week, I hope you'll take some time and share your thoughts about any of the stories in this week's podcast. You can leave those either in the comment section, on Facebook, or Twitter. If you haven't found us on Facebook yet, that address is facebook.com/Asia News Weekly or at Asia News Weekly on Twitter. You can also send an email to the show with your questions, your feedback, or your comments. Just drop a line to podcast@asianewsweekly.net. If you enjoyed this podcast, I hope you'll share it with your friends. And you can also subscribe to this and other podcasts at our website. Just click the tab at the top that says subscribe or those big iTunes and Stitcher buttons. Subscribing is free, and when you do, that next episode is delivered automatically to you. To learn more about any of the stories mentioned in this week's podcast, check out the show notes at asiannewsweekly.net. Well, my friends, that is it for this week's podcast. Thank you very much for listening. For Asia News Weekly, I'm Steve Miller. Asia News Weekly is licensed under a Creative Commons Attribution Non-Commercial No Derivatives 4.0 International License.